And we're live. Well, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Damon Richardson. Welcome, Damon.
Welcome. Well, I'm glad to be on and glad to be a part of this podcast and very excited about today's discussion topic.
Awesome. So today we're going to be talking about a very hot topic. But before we get into that, I want you to introduce yourself to our audience.
All right. Well, I'm originally from Queens, New York, and grew up in Clearwater, Florida. So I am a byproduct of the North and the South. And I was born and raised in the Nation of Islam and became a born-again Christian at the age of 16. Started preaching at the age of 17. And for 27 years now, I've traveled, I've pastored, and my particular interest in ministry is urban apologetics. And so just like you, my focus has been to equip believers to become conversant with the various theologies that we encounter in an urban context, like, of course, the Black Hebrew Israelites, the Nation of Islam, Five Percenters, Nuwabians, and just some of the other ideologies and philosophies that we run into in the urban context. And so that's just a little bit about my ministry, and I am working on a PhD currently in leadership studies. I've spent a number of years matriculating at least 4 or 5 different seminaries, so I've got a pretty wide perspective of the best of all worlds as it relates to your liberal seminaries, your conservative seminaries, and everything in between. So that's just a little bit about me.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad to have you on with us. Today we're going to be talking about hidden colors. And I actually, years ago, had no clue what hidden colors was. I ran into a guy and he was like, you need to watch Hidden Colors. All the answers will be in there as it relates to Black people and faith. So it's very popular amongst Black millennials. It's very popular online, and people actually view this as a scholarly work that we should listen to, and people build arguments around it and use that as their reference point. And so I thought it was very important that we talk about it here on the Jude 3 Project. And thank you, Damon, for being so gracious and giving us your time to talk about this. So for those who haven't heard of Hidden Colors, give us an overview of what the series is about.
So the Hidden Colors series, which was produced by Tariq Nasheed, is primarily about the Black race, and it looks to develop, or it looks to reconstruct a history for Black people in order to demonstrate that, you know, we are a great people, and that we come from a legacy of greatness, but in the process of that mission, it derails itself because it attempts to reconstruct a spiritual and theological history. So it goes into a number of points where it attempts to discredit Christianity, to discredit Jesus Christ, and to posit the idea that Christianity is indeed the white man's religion, and that it has been introduced to us as Black people within the context of oppression and slavery, and therefore it should be rejected by us. And so a lot of the other videos, for instance, number 2, when it gets into melanin, it also starts to it starts to construct a
Can you repeat that for me, Damon? I lost a little reception on your end.
And so melanin becomes more. But it appears to construct a narrative that attempts to deify melanin or blackness and use that as a platform to demonstrate one of the various reasons why black people are great and even greater than white. So it starts to derail itself in a number of different ways by presenting history that is not factual, science that is not factual, Christian history and theology that is not factual. And so at the end of the day, the real goal of Hidden Colors is to glorify Black ethnicity and the Black race in a way that is misleading. It is historically disingenuous. It is a re-mythologized and a historically revisionistic piece that cannot be trusted, and the scholarship is very, very poor.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's important that we understand that, because we live in a day where our culture doesn't trust the history that's presented for good reason. Sometimes we are misrepresented. There's textbooks that show that we were indentured servants and not slaves, and they try to misinform young people in school systems
Exactly.
on the realities of slavery and different things of that nature. It's easy for movies like Hidden Colors to gain traction in our community.
That's right.
People are looking for real history, but you don't combat revisionist history with more revisionist history.
Exactly.
You combat revisionist history with the accurate depiction of history. When you talk about how it tells a false narrative when it relates to Christianity, what are some things there that you see in the series?
One of the things that stood out to me is one of the presenters talked about the Council of Nicaea, and that seems to be one of the go-to discussions for these kind of narratives. And as they were all presenting their narrative on the Council of Nicaea, the first thing that stood out to me is none of that matches what actually happened. For instance, one of the presenters says that when the Arians showed up to the council, that Emperor Constantine put in a hit out on them and attempted to assassinate them, and they fled into Europe. And what Hitler, if Hitler had only known that the real Aryans were actually black people. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's not what happened. That's not even close to what happened. And so they all go into attempting to politicize why Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, and they introduced the narrative that the Bible was created or invented there, and so that is completely false, and nothing like that occurred in history, particularly at the Council of Nicaea. For one, both on the side of Arius and the side of Athanasius, both sides were aware of Jesus's existence, or else the debate would have been moot. There was already a conclusion and an agreement that the books of the Bible were divinely inspired. There was already agreement about the historicity of Jesus. The debate was really about Arius's view that Jesus was a created being, that he was made in a similar substance to the Father, or homoousios, as opposed to homoousios, of the same substance, which was Athanasius's orthodox position of the Trinity. And so that's all that was really on the table at the Council of Nicaea. And it wasn't even Emperor Constantine's, it wasn't his idea to convene the council. It was actually Eusebius of Caesarea's idea to convene this council, and it was his influence upon Constantine that he decided that this kind of fracture in the empire is not a healthy thing. So let's bring the churches together from the East and the West to discuss it, because we don't really want to see division in the empire. So Constantine's, his whole stake in the matter was just Pax Romana, peace in Rome, period, peace throughout the empire. The stake of the church was theological cohesion and orthodoxy. And so, of course, the Nicene Creed was constructed as a result, because Arius's position was refuted as heresy, and that refutation stands till this day.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to note, even when we're dealing with the Council of Nicaea, Dr. Tyson said this last week when he talked about his book on Athanasius, when we had him as a guest, and talked about how Constantine tried to bring Arius back and tried to present him to Athanasius, and Athanasius saying that he kind of converted to Athanasius's position, and then Athanasius wouldn't accept him back. And so Athanasius was kind of shunned for that. So it wasn't like a concoction. I mean, Constantine was, like you said, he was more concerned about peace than doctrinal accuracy. So
that's right. Now, it is a fact that Constantine was swayed by the popularity of Arius's view and was baptized as an Arian by Eusebius of Nicomedia. And Constantine's son, Constantius, was also an Arian. But the view of most of the church in the East and the West was that Athanasius's orthodox position on God was correct, and not Arius's. And so even though Constantine was swayed in the wrong direction, his direction did not mislead or have any bearing on the church's focus on Orthodox Christology and Orthodox theology proper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's something that, is missed in our culture in talking about, it being the white man's religion. Is there any other ways that you see throughout the series that the white man's religion narrative is kind of kind of weaved into the story, besides the Council of Nicaea?
I'm sorry, if you would repeat that question. My connection was a little bad there.
Okay. Is there any other way that you see throughout the series that the narrative that Christianity is the white man's religion is kind of presented outside of the Council of Nicaea?
Yes, yeah. I think one of the problems is that those who would posit the idea that Christianity is the white man's religion, first they misunderstand that Judaism and Christianity, which was a subset of Judaism, its primary geographical focus was the continent of Asia and Africa, not Europe. And so for your first 1,000 years, Christianity is known for its popularity in Asia and in Africa. In fact, just before the Edict of Milan, when the emperors were persecuting the church in the late 1st century, early 2nd century, when that persecution began to be more directed and centralized at Christianity, those greatest attacks were in North Africa. They were not on the continent of Europe, and that was because the greatest expression of Christianity at that time was on the continent of North Africa. And so the reality is that a person positing that idea has to discount your first 1,000 years of Christian history. For instance, even in your 4th century, it's quite interesting. Athanasius, when he was finally promoted to bishop, when he replaced Bishop Alexander of Alexandria, Bishop Athanasius actually gave his approval for a church plant in the area of the Axum Empire that we now know of as Nubia or even Ethiopia, and of course King Izana was one of the very first black kings that led a Christian nation, and this was in the 4th century. And Christianity had already been in North Africa prior to that. We know that, of course, when we're reading the writings of Tertullian, when we have read of the story of Vivia Perpetua and Felicitas, and we know that, of course, from Acts chapter 8, when the Ethiopian eunuch took the gospel back there. We know that because the Coptics had a tradition that Mark planted a church in Egypt in AD 48. This is literally less than 15 years outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then, of course, when you go 200 years after the time of King Uzana, you also have King Negus of the Axum Empire. And it was King Negus that provided refuge for Muhammad, which was the first hijra that is typically not mentioned in Islamic history, because the implications would be that were it not for Christianity, Islam would have died in the desert. So it's quite ironic is that Christianity saves Islam by King Negus, who was a Christian of a Christian nation in Ethiopia, or Abyssinia rather, saved Islam after Muhammad fled many of those who were seeking his life, running through the desert, and sought refuge in Abyssinia. And so he provided refuge for Muhammad and his followers for at least 7 years. And so this is hundreds and hundreds of years before slave ships would have arrived in the event that we now know of as the transatlantic slavery. So these guys, their history is just way too late to make the claim that Christianity is a white man's religion.
Mm-hmm. What are the other problematic portions as it relates to history in Hidden Colors?
One of the ones that was incredibly problematic was this false theory about the 16 crucified saviors. I mean, this is the worst kind of history that one could ever create. So here's how that thing goes. I'm trying to remember the name of the author that first posited this. He wrote a book actually called The 16 Crucified Saviors. But what he does conveniently is he changes the names of many of these so-called messiahs so that it has more of a similarity. So for instance, with Krishna, he spells it with a CH so that it gives the impression that it has something to do in origin with Christ, whereas Krishna actually means dark. It has nothing to do with Christos in the Greek, which would be the Greek word for Mashiach in the Hebrew, which would mean anointed one. And so he attempts to use phonology or phonetics in order to create similarity in sound. And even when he talks about one so-called Messiah named Hessus, Hessus, he uses more of a Latinized pronunciation, so it sounds like Jesus, so that he can draw a line in between that and Jesus. But Hessus actually means in a Galish dialect, it actually means master, whereas Yeshua from the Hebrew means salvation. And so there is, it's not a cognate from another language. It's completely unrelated. And so most of these guys, there's no source documentation for the historicity of most of these so-called saviors. And the other 12 that you do find in historical writings, there is no actual similarity between what those histories say about them and the history of Jesus Christ. So you have a remythologized version and a revisionistic history of they attempt to say that they all have mothers named Mary, they all died and rose again. Almost none of those guys, for instance, Mithra is not known to have died at all in Persian mythology, let alone died and raised again 3 days later. And so the facts is that this 16 crucified Savior is not factual at all. It is not based on any scholarly histories or corollaries that come from documented source evidence. So the reality is that this stuff is completely contrived and made up by people whose modus operandi is simply to discredit Christianity and discredit Jesus Christ. And people who want to believe that, they need no evidence. You need no evidence to desire to believe that. All you really need to do is really have it in for Christianity, and that will suffice. But that kind of history is just not based on any evidence whatsoever.
Mhm. I think that's important to know, because when we talk about, how they like to make, like you said, the Persian mythology, then you go back to Egyptian mythology. There's always this going back and saying, okay, well, this is Christianity is borrowing from mythology in an effort to disprove it. And so I know you talked about some other problematic things you saw in the movie. What are those?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
What is another problematic portion that stood out to you in the movie, besides the Council of Nicaea and the other mythological connections?
Well, some of the other things that stood out to me was some of the science that went into the discussion. For instance, the discussion on melanin, some of the other histories as it related to Kemet and Kemetic history. Um, I think that is really the crux of where the hidden series goes. At the end of the day, the idea behind it, the thrust, the impetus behind that series is to really elevate Kemeticism above Christianity, and so it constructs a number of histories about how the Egyptians knew certain things before the Hebrews knew it. Um, Let me just say this, because the problems are almost nebulous, but here's the problem with the entire argument. The argument is based on what you would call an argument from antiquity, and that is the idea that because something is ancient, that it must be of necessity right because it is old. Well, that makes no more sense than talking about than constructing an argument from modernity. That is, an argument must be right because it is new. And so this is what a lot of people don't realize, that because you can dig up artifacts from ancient Egypt, no matter how old they are, or no matter how old these histories are, that doesn't follow. It doesn't follow that Egyptian Kemeticism or Egyptian religion is something that is reliable, is something that is divine. The age of it has nothing to do with the truthfulness of it. And that is the construct, that is the position that people who look at these histories don't understand how old something is. For instance, the Epic of Gilgamesh predates the book of Genesis, but that doesn't mean that the Epic of Gilgamesh has truth in it. And in fact, most of what is written in the Epic of Gilgamesh is more fable. And so the age of a thing doesn't necessarily mean that it is truthful. And that's how we've got to look at this series, is that is the idea that is presented, is that Kemeticism is older, therefore it's more truer. And once you bite the hook or the bait for that, everything else starts making sense to you because you think, oh, wow, that's older, so it must be truer. And that is the kernel and the seed that they plant in your mind early on in series, the first video and the second video. And from there, the other two installments, they've got you.
Mhm. I think this has been extremely helpful and a really good, solid overview for people as they're understanding and navigating the series and getting questions about it. I know there's tons and tons of details that we could go over, and we will be here all day trying to, trying to go over every detail, but I think you provided a great overview. For those who want to get deeper into the things you address, the sources you use as you're navigating through things like hidden colors, what would you recommend to them?
One of the things I would, two books that I would recommend, and actually they're in volumes, but I think one of the greatest gifts that we have today from a church history standpoint is Justo Gonzalez. And he was a professor actually out at Emory, at Candler, Candler Seminary in Atlanta. And but he has a volume, a series called History of Christian Thought. There is it's a 3-volume series, and then he has a great church history called The Story of Christianity. And so I would highly recommend anybody starting with Justo Gonzalez's Story of Christianity and the History of Christian Thought, because he walks the reader through all of the important thinkers, theologians, scholars, and major players throughout church history. He walks the reader through what the issues were at each point throughout church history, and the reaction of the Eastern Church and the Western Church to those issues, which were through the first 5 centuries typically Christological discussions. And so he walks you all the way through from the dawn of Christianity all the way through the Reformation and the period of the Enlightenment. And you can see the development of Christianity from century to century in a beautiful picture that is a real easy read. Although Gonzalez is a top-notch scholar, it is easy reading for anybody that is interested in a accurate and scholarly presentation of church history.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. We had to read him for church history, so
Absolutely.
he's a great book. How would people get in contact with you, Damon, on social media?
Okay, good. Well, I'm just really starting to kind of break into this whole social media thing. So every Monday on Facebook, I do a live discussion that is usually centered around some apologetic or some controversial issue. It's usually every Monday at 7:30. I also move those videos over to my YouTube channel, which is Damon Richardson Ministries. And so if you go to YouTube and subscribe, I've got roughly about 40 videos there that range in topics. Some of them might be exegetical, but typically they're going to be addressing one apologetic type issue, or even just some sort of doctrinal matter that says, here's how we should think about this particular theological or doctrinal issue as it confronts us in the church. So those are 2 typical ways. I do have a website, but it is in the process of actually adding content. So there's not a lot there right now for me to be able to direct somebody there too. But so Facebook and YouTube would be the primary ways of getting in contact with me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Damon, for your time. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on as a guest. And I really appreciate your ministry and your tenacity at getting this information out and sharing it with the world and the body of Christ, so that we can do, as 1 Peter 3:15 says, to be ready to give an answer to every man that asks, a reason of the hope within us with gentleness and with respect. So much respect to you, and God bless you in your ministry as well.
Awesome.